every teacher you talk to is going to have a different viewpoint, even within the same orchestra, of how a certain excerpt's supposed to go. And it really kind of teaches you that in the end, you have to figure out what you want to do with those excerpts, with that music, and just believe in yourself and go do it.
There are people on my 2 interview list like Micah Howard that have been on there for years and years and years, probably a decade at this point. In fact, when I go back and look at people that have been recommended to be on the show, Micah's name is on there going back to 2007. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with Pittsburgh Symphony bassist and Carnegie Mellon bass teacher Micah Howard. And in the craziest set of coincidences, I had been hoping to have Mike on the show and planning, and I finally sent him an email. And that same morning, and I hadn't checked my email, just sent it off. It was in my to-do list, did that before checking my email, checked my email about an hour later, and found that Micah had sent, before I sent that message, he'd sent me a message that same exact day to invite me to be part of the Pittsburgh Bass Symposium for 2019. We hadn't ever really communicated before, especially over email, and just the fact that we were both in touch with each other without knowing it at the same moment, the same day. Talk about, well, it was meant to be. So Micah has had a wonderful career. There's so many great takeaways in this episode, all about auditioning and his experience being on the core audition committee for the Pittsburgh Symphony, the 4 times he auditioned for the Pittsburgh Symphony, and how his playing developed through those times, and then he finally ended up getting a spot in the orchestra. Advice for his younger self. So many other great takeaways. I know you're going to love this conversation. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, A440, Upton Bass, Robertson & Sons, and D'Addario Strings. More on them later. But let's dig into this conversation with Pittsburgh Symphony bassist and Carnegie Mellon bass professor Micah Howard. Maybe we could just start by, so you grew up in Ohio near Pittsburgh. Just tell me about your early years in the bass. When did you start playing? Was bass your first instrument? What were those first years like for you?
My first instrument was piano. My mom started me on piano when I was 4. I have 4 younger siblings, and my mom's a violist and a pianist, so she wanted us all to be violinists, actually. Okay. So, and my dream instrument when I was really young was the trumpet. So I went through a lot of instruments: clarinet, trumpet, violin was the focus when I started on that in 4th grade. I hated the violin the whole entire time. But so the bass, how did that come about? Well, I have 4 younger siblings, like I said. Everybody plays music. My mom plays music. My dad is an electrician, and he wanted to learn an instrument. So one day he brought a bass home because he told me, he said, I wanted to pick an instrument that was easy. So I picked the bass, he told me. I told this expecting a laugh so many times when I tell that to people, and people just look at me like, yeah, no, it's not easy. But anyway, I just sat, and we didn't have a living room. We had a music room. And I was just sitting there watching him struggling with the bass, and I just asked him if I could try it, and I immediately fell in love with it. And that was it. I was 12 years old. I went to my orchestra director the next day and said, I don't want to play violin anymore. I want to play bass. And he said, no, you're a violinist. I said, not anymore. I want to play bass. So that was it. That's how it all started. He was the major influence, my orchestra director at school. He was the orchestra director for the whole city school system. So I started on violin with him in 4th grade, and in middle school he was the music director there and the violin teacher. And he stayed every day with me after school to help me get caught up on the double bass so I wasn't too far behind. Huge influence on me. And he's passed away, but yeah, I really feel a lot of debt toward him for my success in music. Mm-hmm. So, and he also is probably the main reason why I love, teaching also, to be honest. It's because of him.
Wow. Yeah, one of those influences can make or break a person at that age. I had my middle school orchestra director. In hindsight, I was like, the only reason I play bass now is because of him. I was a violinist too, and he took me in, and I think 3 times a week he gave me a bass lesson during lunch. I'd eat my lunch, and he'd teach me, and he pulled me into the South Dakota Symphony to sub when I was in high school, and it's like it would have been a totally different world. So those people are huge.
Oh yeah.
And then bass teacher wise, when did you start? Who were some of your first early mentors and influences and people you worked with?
Okay, my very first real double bass teacher was Rodney Van Sickle, who was a member of the Pittsburgh Symphony. He's also passed away. He passed away about 2 years ago. I bought one of his basses. I have his locker at work. I have his mailbox at work. I have his tour number, the whole thing. So it's really wonderful. Rodney Van Sickle. He went to Curtis. That's where he studied. So I started with him when I was 16. And the story behind that is, my family didn't have very much money. They thought that I should study with somebody in the Pittsburgh Symphony, especially because I had been playing in the youth symphony already for a few years. And they thought it was important for me to really have a real bass teacher, because I hadn't that up to that point. Because my teacher in middle school and high school, he was a violist, but he did his very best with me on the bass. And like I said, he did great things with me. But my parents called every bass player in the Pittsburgh Symphony, Tony Bianco, Jeff Turner had just joined, I think, to see who charged the least amount of money. And Denny charged $15. This was back in the late 80s, right? And he would give me 3-hour lessons. It was great. But I'll never forget the first lesson. I think I played the first movement of the Dragonetti concerto for him. And he looked at me and he said, that's all great and everything that you can play this, but this is what you really need to learn how to play. And he put Ein Heldenleben in front of me.
Oh.
So that was my first experience with really starting to get to be familiar with the repertoire, the orchestral lit. So,
and then Youngstown State.
Yes.
Were Pittsburgh Symphony bassists teaching at Youngstown? Who'd you study with there?
Tony Leonardi was his name.
Okay.
He's also passed away. He played with Woody Herman. He was a jazz bass player. And you might be interested to know that another member of the PSO is a former student of Tony. Jeff Grubb studied with Tony Bianco, with Tony Leonardi as well.
Okay.
We both went to Youngstown State. Jeff was there about 8 years before I was, but we both think it's kind of cool that there are 2 of us in the bass section in Pittsburgh that went to Youngstown State. So I was accepted into a lot of really great schools, Cleveland Institute, Carnegie Mellon. But my parents were very religious. I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. I am no longer a Jehovah's Witness, and they really wanted me to stay much closer to home. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of pressure on me to go to Youngstown State University. And and Denny Van Sickle was so upset that I did that. But anyway, it all worked out fine. Yeah.
And after that, you studied with Jeff? Had you known Jeff prior to that, or played for Jeff? When did you first meet Jeff Turner?
I think the first time I met Jeff was, we both talk about this a lot because we're not really sure, but when I was in the Youth Symphony, we did a side-by-side concert where I shared a stand with somebody that was tall with dark hair, which could have been either Jeff or Ron Cantelm. It might have been Jeff. I'm not sure. So that might have been the first time that I met him. But I really didn't get to know Jeff until he came to play a recital at Youngstown State my junior year, I think. And I introduced myself to him then. And my teacher, Rodney Van Sickle, had been suggesting that I go play for Jeff at that point anyway. And so it was soon after that I went and played for Jeff for the first time. And what happened is I then, shortly after that, got married to my first wife, and I actually dropped out of school. I dropped out of school, stopped practicing, stopped doing everything, and tried to find another career because she was a Russian immigrant. I have a stepdaughter from the marriage, and right away my son was born very soon after we got married. So I felt like I couldn't really pursue music anymore. But I had terrible luck with everything else that I was doing. I hated everything else that I tried to do, including life insurance, selling cleaning products. Went through all kinds of stuff like that. And just one day, my ex-wife and we just decided that I should go back and finish my undergrad and then talk to Jeff about doing a master's degree and just give it another shot and see what happens. So, man, when that happened, I was in the practice room all the time because I was worried that I hated everything that I was doing. And I realized, man, this is all I really want to do is play in an orchestra. So I really kicked my butt. I practiced like crazy after that. So
how long were you out from school? Was it a year or a couple of years or
a year?
Okay.
A year.
Okay. Yeah. Sometimes those moments can be real moments of clarity in terms of career. Like I never had anything like that, but I did have an absolutely loathsome job working as a file clerk at Citibank. And I realized if there's one thing I don't want to do with my life, it's work as a file clerk at Citibank. And I think that upped my practice time and intensity and dedication considerably after that.
Right. That'll do it.
Yeah. You've worked with Jeff for years and years and years. What was he like as a teacher in those early years for you? How was he different than who you'd worked with before? What did you guys work on? What was that whole experience like?
Well, first of all, Jeff is only 8 years older than me, so he was the youngest teacher I ever had. Mm-hmm. And Jeff really focused on my technique quite a bit. Nobody really worked with me on how to hold the bow or anything like that before I studied with Jeff. So he totally revamped my technical abilities. And of course, he focused a lot on the orchestral lit, but he also was very insistent on solo performances. I had to give 2 full recitals while I was at Duquesne with Jeff. He really changed the way I play the bass significantly in terms of technique. So I'm very grateful to him for that. And he's a wonderful guy. I'm sure you've heard he's going to be in Indiana next year, right?
Yeah, that is fantastic. That is fantastic news and great pick. And the wise choice on Indiana's part and all around. And the bass world is really, that it's been a great school for a long time, and having Jeff along with Kurt Muroki there, it's always been a great place to go to school. But wow, what an exciting new chapter for Indiana and for Jeff too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. He's so excited. And I think it makes total sense for him to be there because he studied with, Larry Hurst. I mean, it's just the perfect, scenario, I think, for that school. And you're right. Jeff and Kurt will be great together. It's going to be great.
Yeah, I did a master class with Jeff in 1995. I was at Northwestern. He came and he worked with the students. It was just absolutely amazing. I've been such a fan of his ever since. Right. And was that around when you were doing your master's?
That was my second year of my master's. That would have been my second year.
Okay. Yeah. And that's when you won the ISB competition, orchestral competition, right?
Right.
95? Right. Okay.
At Bloomington. And Owen Lee won the concerto, the solo competition that same year.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're going back in time some years, but what was that? What was that? Did Jeff encourage you to do that? What was your motivations for doing that? And what was that whole experience like doing the orchestra competition?
Well, Jeff did encourage me to do that. I was taking auditions already, but not doing very well at all. So that was I would consider that my first real successful audition. In addition to a sub audition I won with Pittsburgh, I auditioned for the Pittsburgh Symphony a total of 4 times, twice for a sub position. I got the sub position the second time, and twice for a permanent position. So the second time I won the audition with John Moore. We both won at the same time. But yeah, Jeff encouraged me to take that, and it was it's done quite differently than it is now. Now they use a screen. There's no screen, and I really didn't know all these people, but boy, did I knew of them, right? So Stuart Sankey was on the panel, and Larry Hurst, of course, because it was at Bloomington, and let's see, who else was there? Jeff Braditich. Boy, his name escapes me now. Peter, former principal bass in Minnesota.
Oh, Peter Lloyd.
Peter Lloyd was on the panel. Bob Gladstone was on the panel. So my favorite story to tell about that is I finished playing both of the major excerpts on the fourth movement of the 40th Symphony of Mozart, right? They all started arguing with each other about my tempo. Some thought I was too fast. Some thought I was too slow. And they just were openly arguing while I was there about my tempo. It was really something. Like, it was blowing my mind.
Well, maybe you had the perfect tempo. If everybody's disagreeing, maybe that's the,
Oh, God, who knows? I mean, I thought I played okay, but it was not my best. So I was really happy that I won it. I mean, it's not one of those auditions where I walked away feeling, or one of those performances. I mean, they're very rare where you just walk away feeling good about them, but that definitely wasn't one of them. But yeah, I'm thankful that I won that audition. It was great. So, and it was a great experience. Actually, hearing them have that discussion was eye-opening for me, because when you're that young, you kind of get into this idea that there's this way of doing these things, and there isn't. There are so many different approaches. Every teacher you talk to is going to have different viewpoint, even within the same orchestra, of how a certain excerpt's supposed to go. And it really kind of teaches you that in the end, you have to figure out what you want to do with those excerpts, with that music, and just believe in yourself and go do it.
That's something you talk about in your technique book, and that's something that I was just chatting about with Joe McFadden, who's recently moved up to principal bass for Atlanta, and he was saying he went through a couple of years recently, really within the last 5 years, we're taking some auditions, and he just sort of got into his head that he was trying to do things the way he thought others wanted to hear, and when he just was like, no, I'm just going to be true to myself and do it. That's when things started to click again. I think it's an interesting concept, and at a young age, although I guess at an older age too, but at a young age, that's a real easy thing to fall into.
Yeah, well, you hear, they do it this way in Cleveland, and they do it that way in Philadelphia, and they do it that way in Chicago. And the bottom line is, I don't think there is one way that anybody does any. I mean, we all change over the years. Our style of playing changes, and with each orchestra, the music director has a huge influence on the way the orchestra plays. So, for instance, if you listen to a recording of an orchestra and think, well, that must be the way the bass section likes it, not necessarily. I've done enough recordings to know that I would not recommend playing certain excerpts the way we did in certain recordings. So, yeah, it really all boils down to, you have to be a great musician to win these jobs, but you also have to believe in yourself. And I don't think that I think it would be unusual to lose an audition because, for instance, your spiccato wasn't high enough or something, something silly like that. Ultimately, if they really like you, they can ask you to play it over again. Yeah. So.
Well, for you, so you auditioned for Pittsburgh Symphony 4 times, 2 for the sub list and 2 for the, what, if anything, changed for you, practicing wise, preparation wise, mindset wise, for those auditions, between audition 1 for that sub list and then ultimately getting a position? Was it just persistence or did you have any breakthroughs between that audition number 1 and audition 4?
Yeah, I think the first time I auditioned, I just was not ready, really.
Okay. Yeah.
And even the second time when I won the sub audition, I mean, it was so long ago, really, but I don't think I was really where I needed to be. And the first time I auditioned for a regular position, it was the worst. The final audition was one of the worst auditions I ever played. And I remember exactly when it ended. played Britain Young Person's Guide, and I just totally botched the last glissando up to the G. I'm sure everything else is pretty bad, but that is the thing that I remember the most. And I remember they said thank you right after I botched that harmonic. And I remember looking out there, and I swear that Lauren Mizell was laughing at me. But I mean, I'm not sure. And back then, the audition process has changed dramatically in Pittsburgh since then. But back then, Lauren Mizell was the one that hired you. I mean, the committee would make a recommendation, but then he's the one that made the final decision. Same with when Janssens was there. Now in Pittsburgh, it's a nine musicians plus the music director, and the music director gets one vote. So that's changed dramatically since then. But yeah, I mean, I felt so bad about that audition. There was no reason for me to believe that I won it. Mm-hmm. But the one that I actually did win was one of those times when I played where I actually felt really good about it. And I know some people say they feel really good about an audition and then they don't, it doesn't work out for them. That happens quite a bit. But this time it lined up. I felt really good about it, and I won the audition. I had to wait a whole week to hear.
Oh, really?
Right away. No, I got a phone call at home about a week later. And the same thing the first time through. It took a week for them to let me know that I hadn't won the audition.
What was surprising? And I've talked to other people. You get into an orchestra like the Pittsburgh Symphony, it's one of the world's great orchestras. What was and the reality of being on the job, and now you're in a different phase of life, can be surprising to some people. Do you remembering back to '96 and getting that job? What was surprising about all of a sudden the day-to-day, 8 services a week existence, if anything? Did anything that you weren't expecting?
Well, actually, the thing that was very weird for me is the fact that you have to really learn how to structure the rest of your life, because I was so busy. Don't forget, when I was in grad school, like I said, I had 2 kids. So I was working on my master's. I was working a part-time job at Radio Shack, practicing all the time. I would often stay in the school and not go home, and to get my papers done and everything. And I was very worried about my grades too, because if I didn't win a job, my next step was to go work on my doctorate. So I was very focused on my grades and my playing. So the thing that was very strange for me when I won the job was, wow, now I do these services, like 8 services a week, the rehearsals and concerts. I had to prepare for those. I had to learn how to really be disciplined and structure my life so that I continued to do the things that I needed to do to be a professional musician. Because it would be so easy to just forget about the practicing, honestly, and, just kind of make it by.
Right.
And I didn't want to be one of those kinds of players. And in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Symphony, it would have been very difficult to do that, to be honest, because everybody has so much integrity in the orchestra, and you would have been, if I had stopped practicing, that would not have been good for me, okay, in terms of how my colleagues would have viewed me. So, but yeah, that was strange. Suddenly being in total control of all this time that I had to practice and to pursue other things, including teaching. Mm-hmm. So.
Wow. Anybody listening to this that thinks that that they've got some pressure on them, having 2 kids and working at Radio Shack and taking the auditions and having all those financial and family pressures, that's, congratulate young Micah for, landing that job in those circumstances. I think many have thrown in the towel with much, much fewer items on their plate than that.
Well, like I said, man, doing those other jobs, I just couldn't see myself doing anything else. I mean, yeah.
Hey, this is Danny Zeman. I'm a jazz bass player currently living in Basel, Switzerland. Originally from the Western New York region, Buffalo, and then Rochester. I tour throughout the States, throughout Europe, Asia, playing various styles of jazz, Lindy hops, early swing, more modern jazz. Currently, again, living in Switzerland for the next year or so. Right now, I'm playing the D'Addario Helicore Pizzicatos, and I've been using them for about 7 years now, and I have to say they are my favorite string for jazz. The clarity in sound and tone, intonation, everything is just exactly what I'm looking for. They're not too bright. There's a really wonderful musical sustain that you can manipulate, for when you're playing ballads or more up-tempo tunes. I mean, just the range of color and control that you get out of them is just exactly what I need. It suits my needs perfectly, and I definitely encourage anyone who's looking for a new string to check out or wants something that is great for jazz and gives you more of that sustained sound. Definitely consider the Helicore pizzicatos.
So I'd love to explore that a little bit, like 8 services a week, and you need to keep in shape, and you've got all this new rep, and you need to play at the standard. What did your practicing start to look like, or maybe what does your practicing look like in recent years? Do you have a set routine you go through on a daily basis? How is that all structured for you?
Okay. Well, when I first joined, I became very close with the associate principal bass, Don Evans, who has passed away. I don't know if you know about that. And because I was fairly young and hadn't played a lot of the repertoire yet, he actually spent a lot of time with me, and we would work on stuff together. It was great. It was like my education was continuing. So there was a lot of focus on just really getting my all the rep under my fingers. But now, after being in the orchestra for as long as I have been, I see the same rep coming back over and over again. So when something comes back again, it's just a matter of brushing up the material and working on it that way. So I always try to either do recitals or do solo performances throughout the year, play for my class, things like that. So what I do is I basically do about 15 to 20 minutes of a warm-up with scales. And also I'm doing a lot with Galen McCormick's bowing book right now. Something you probably don't know is I play German bow now. I've been doing it for 2 years. It's because nobody really has given me an actual diagnosis, but it's probably focal dystonia because I don't have any pain. But about 2 years ago, I lost the ability to play French bow. My thumb buckles under, and I actually thought that my career was over. It was a really horrible time. But then one day it just dawned on me, wait a second, there's another bow. So, and luckily for me, I have been teaching students to play German bow for a long time. Never really played it myself, but knew the mechanics of it. And also Aaron White, who's in the orchestra, is a German bow player. So I do, so in my warm-up now, to make a long story short, over the last 2 years, a couple of things have happened. One is I really have had to relearn all the rep. And it's been refreshing because it's like approaching all this stuff that I've known for so many years again in a new way. I've really enjoyed it. It's helped with my teaching also dramatically. When I work with a German bow student now, I have a lot more insight into how the German bow works. And in some ways, I kind of wish I had focused on the German bow earlier, to be honest. There are a lot of things that are easier to do, I think, after this 2 years of working on it. When I first did it, it was miserable because the bow wants to just jump off the string all the time, and it felt so difficult to control. But yeah, over the last couple of years, a lot of focus on my bowing technique, and I still do that every day. I do my scales, which are in that scale book that you went through. I start with my long tones, and then after doing that for about 10 minutes, I then move to doing some exercises in Galen's book, specifically the second book, which is all about staccato. And I just been working my way through those. And then if there's something that I'm doing new in the orchestra, I'll spend time on that, and then I move on to my solo rep.
Okay.
So,
So wow, we'll go. Congratulations on finding a way through that, potential focal dystonia or whatever was going on. That's one of the great things I guess we have as bass players is we have another option,
Right.
What have you found now that you're comfortable with it? What have you found to be easier for German bow? Is it specific bow strokes or different types of rep, or what seems to click with you with the German bow?
Well, first of all, mastering either bow is extremely difficult, as any bass player knows, or any string player. So I don't want to make it sound like anything's really easy, because it's not. But I do think that now that I've learned how to control that bounce, its propensity to bounce off the string, I do think that the spiccato bow strokes are coming a little easier for me on the German bow than they did on the French bow. Mm-hmm. Also, they're a little bit longer, so the sustaining longer notes is a little easier, although I'm a short guy, so by the time I get to the end of the bow, I do have to manage keeping the bow straight by moving my body just a little bit, which is a little strange because I never had to do that with the French bow at all. But I would say that also just, for instance, when I play a Tchaikovsky symphony or a Shostakovich symphony now, my hand is not as tired as it used to be with the French bow. With the French bow, I often would actually take my thumb at the end of a Tchaikovsky symphony or something and put it at the bottom of the bow to just pull out the kind of sound, the big sound that I wanted, and always felt so exhausted afterward. I don't feel that exhaustion as much anymore with the German bow. So just a couple of things, but yeah.
Interesting. Well, sort of transitioning a bit, another topic besides practicing and technique that people love hearing about, and you've had a lot of experience in from the other side now, is auditioning, right? You were on the core committee, right, for Pittsburgh Symphony, right. So you were listening to every instrument during those years. So I'm sure you learned a lot about auditioning and how people audition and what people listen for in different instruments. It's a huge topic, but I don't even know where to start with something like that. But what are some takeaways you've learned about auditioning, the process of auditioning, as a result of being a part of that process with the Pittsburgh Symphony?
Well, first, before I even started serving on the audition committee, they asked me to proctor my first season, because the first season you can't really serve on an audition committee. You have to have tenure first. So they asked me to proctor. That was a huge learning experience because I saw how other people dealt with their nerves or didn't deal with their nerves while they were on the stage. A lot of people would have notes that they would go through before every excerpt that they played or whatever. So that was kind of eye-opening. Also, it was fun for me to make my own judgment about the player and then hear what the committee had decided at the end of it. So that was a great learning experience right there. Once I started serving on the committee, it just reinforces this idea that believing that there's one way of playing something is you just can't think that way, because it's amazing how differently people hear things on the committee, whether it's a violin committee, an oboe committee, clarinet, percussion. Percussion was very interesting for me because at that time, it was when I served on that committee, it was one of the first committees I served on, and it was so difficult for me to understand what they were listening for in a cymbal splash or something like that. I can hear it now, but boy, back then that was really, really difficult. But you learn so much from the other committee members, how they're listening, what they're listening for. Some people are really focused on time or pitch or something like that. Well, other people are more focused on phrasing, and also different committees and different instruments have their own way of listening. If you're serving on a bass committee, I would say, at least in Pittsburgh, that there's been a lot of focus on, making sure your time is good and all that stuff that all bass players hear about, right? We all do. Then you serve on other committees, and really there's not a lot of talk about that. There's a lot of talk about the colors and the phrasing and things like that. So all that was a great learning experience for me.
I remember talking to somebody about the first time they were listening to percussion auditions. It was probably for the Chicago Symphony, but that I don't know if you guys asked for that Czech 4 crash cymbal excerpt at the end.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so just like the experience of hearing like person after person after person after person play that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that one, because that one, it became clearer and clearer to me what's listened for. For instance, how tight the crash is, and whether they're actually keeping time in that instance. Because the interesting thing about the percussion auditions is they often don't want to hear necessarily strict time. They want to hear how you're going to be flexible with your time with the percussion audition. But in that instance, there's no room for any kind of rubato or anything. You have to keep strict time. So, yeah.
What's for Pittsburgh Symphony? Look, what's the makeup of a typical audition panel for, say, like, let's say there was a second violin opening? Would it be just violinists and then the music director comes at the end, or would it be a couple other principal players? Is that different on a section by section basis, or like who's behind that screen? I guess.
Okay, the audition language has a different makeup for basically all the different. For instance, all the string positions have a certain makeup. So you're going to have 2 members of what's called the core audition committee. Mm-hmm. That's the committee that I served on when I served on all these different committees. So there are 2 of us, and in addition to voting on the players, those core audition members make sure that the contract is being followed during the audition process. That's an important part of that. You count the votes and all that stuff too. Okay, you make sure that the personnel manager, for instance, is following the contract properly. Make sure that in Pittsburgh, everybody in the prelims, for instance, has to play between 6 and 8 minutes or the same material, whichever comes first. So as a core committee member, you make sure that everybody plays the same amount of music or the same amount of time. You also are not allowed to just talk with anybody during the prelims or during any of the auditions. So everybody has to sit apart. So the core audition committee members make sure that people are sitting apart, not trying to influence somebody else's vote or anything like that. So there are 9 total musicians on each committee. So 2 of them are the core audition committee. And I'm trying to remember everybody else. I think there are 4 section members, and then 3 principals, one from related sections. Okay. 3 principals from me. I think that's basically it. And then when you do woodwinds and percussion, it changes somewhat in that way. But that's basically it. And then so that's 9 musicians for the prelims and semis, and then the music director comes in for the finals. And in Pittsburgh, the screen comes down after prelims.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then discussion between committee members, does that not happen until the finals, or does that after you get through the prelims? Or are you solitary with just scoring until a certain point? How does that all work?
No, there's discussion. There's discussion after each vote. So after the prelim vote, you can have a discussion. If somebody is on the with one more vote might have been able to pass prelims, you can discuss that person and then re-vote. They're all anonymous votes by ballot. And then in the semifinals, because the screen comes down, although you don't have a discussion during the audition, one nice thing is any member of the committee can ask a candidate to play something over again in a different way. And there's a lot more discussion in the semifinal round. You can just, even if somebody got just one vote, you can stand up and say number, or at that point it won't be a number. It'd be so-and-so. I really like this player. I don't understand why you guys didn't like this player. Can we talk about him? And sometimes that changes the vote. Sometimes you re-vote and people convince others that this person should go through. So it's interesting seeing that play out.
Okay. Yeah.
And then in the finals, there's a lot of discussion with the music director, and the way you vote there is anybody that gets 2/3 vote qualifies to be in the orchestra. And then if there are ties, which there often are, because at that point you're talking about really great players. So we're talking one time in finals there were 10 finalists. So you can be talking about a lot of players, and so often there could be these ties, and so you have to have tiebreakers and things like that. It gets to be pretty open at that point in terms of how actually pick the finals, including asking people to come back and play with the orchestra for a week or two.
Okay, I got a bunch of follow-up questions. Okay, so one, you've been in this situation a lot where someone's been asked to play something again, and I've been in that situation when I've taken auditions. Like, what advice might you have for someone in that moment? They just played something, someone asked them to play it again. Like what? How might they want to interpret that or think about that, or like what are what have you noticed that's successful or not successful in that situation? Any direction you might want to take that?
Well, first of all, make sure that you completely understand what you're being asked to do, because I think sometimes people just start playing it again without really understanding what they're being asked. Mm-hmm. And you have to be careful not to offend anybody on the committee. And that's hard to do too, because there's so many different personalities, but you should be careful about the way you frame the questions. But if they ask you to play it faster, it might be good to know what tempo they want to hear. So you might ask the proctor, can you ask, maybe not directly to the committee, but ask the proctor, can you find out like how fast they might want this? But just be clear, make sure you're clear on what they want. That's very, very important. And also not to get offended. I think some people actually get upset, but it's a good thing if you get asked to play something again. That means they like what you're doing. So try not to get offended. And if they might be asking you to do something that you feel strongly that it shouldn't be done that way. It's very possible. But if you want to win the job, you probably should try to accommodate it. And part of being an orchestra player is we have to do things all the time that whoever's on that podium is asking us to do. And very often it's not the way we want to do it. So be careful not to get offended and make sure you're clear on what they want to hear. I think those are the important things.
In terms of if we think about bass auditions for a second, and people that aren't bass players on the committee, like how do they view the bass that might be surprising to a bassist? Because I think I've played for trombonists and violinists and pianists. And I'm always surprised at the comments I get. They're things I never think of. They're like, like I can't hear it in the notes is one I would get a lot. I hear a lot of like whacking on the strings, but what are some takeaways that some of your other highly skilled colleagues that play other instruments, what do they notice about the bass?
Well, the thing that any instrument that you play, what you fall into is there's all this baggage on all of the lit that we play. Not only our own baggage, but the baggage we carry from our teachers and anybody else that we played for that plays our instruments. So we have all these preconceived ideas of what this literature has to sound like. Mm-hmm. But these other players, they don't. They're listening to it more on a purely musical level, which I think is really awesome, because they don't know, for instance, all the struggles you might have had with the trio, or how bass players how high do we play it off the string? Is it on the string? Is it off the string? All those things. They're not thinking about any of that. Unless they're, for instance, a cellist, they might have more of a, it might be a similar view. So they're really listening to it more on a purely musical level, and I love that. And I love playing for other musicians because of that. They don't have all that baggage. It's wonderful to play for other musicians in that way. And I think often when you're playing for instance, a principal audition, it could very often be that you're playing for mostly non-bass players, for instance, because when we had the associate principal bass opening here, most of the bass players, except for Jeff Turner and Betsy Heston, took the audition. So there were only 2 bass players on that 9 musician committee, just 2. So you're playing for people that don't have all that baggage. So that can often happen. So I think it's important to play for other instrumentalists, because you need to know what they're listening for too.
This episode is brought to you by Robertson & Sons Violins. For more than 40 years, over 4 decades, Robertson & Sons has specialized in providing the highest quality stringed instruments and bows to collectors, professional musicians, music educators, and students of all ages. Their modern facility, which is totally beautiful, by the way, if you're ever able to make it out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, I highly recommend it. They have a recital hall that they use not only for performances, but it's a available to their clients. So if you want to try out a fine pedigree bass or even a student bass or anything in between, you can go in that recital hall. I've had the chance to do that. Totally amazing. I'm like a kid in the candy store when I'm down there at Robertsons. Check them out online at robertsonsviolins.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the good folks at Upton Bass String Instrument Company. Eric and Gary and the whole Upton team, I can't say enough good things about them. And they have been on board with the various endeavors I've done online from the start. They were one of the early sponsors of the blog back in 2006 and 2007. And it has been so fun to follow along with their journey and see them develop these new models of basses like the car bass, the Bostonian, the Bohemian, and to connect with all these amazing players. I've had the privilege of speaking with so many people that play Upton basses, from Eric Rivas of Branford Marcellus's band and Lucia Torino of The Devil Makes Three, all the way over to Anthony Monzo of the New Century Chamber Orchestra and Kevin Smith, Willie Nelson's bass player. I've had many students purchase Upton basses over the years. I've had a lot of colleagues play Upton basses. I see them on gigs all the time. They play great, and Upton stands behind their work. Can't recommend them highly enough. Check them out online at uptonbass.com. Another topic that people ask about a lot that I think would be really interesting, maybe a two-part question. Do you think it's advisable to play differently or have a different mindset for different rounds, like getting through the prelims, semis, finals, or one plays at one as one plays and takes all the chances in every round? Or I don't know if you've thought about that or talked with people about that, but should one approach the actual playing of a prelim round differently than a final round, just from the player perspective?
Well, let me start from the committee's perspective first, because I think that helps to inform the player, right? I do think that the prelims is the most challenging round, because that's the round that the committee's listening to many players one after the other. And in Pittsburgh, it's usually around 100 players. We usually get around 300 applicants, and by our contract, we narrow it down to about 100 players. And so we're hearing all these players back to back, and it really, I hate to say it because it just sounds horrible, but it's kind of like an elimination round, like you're just trying to weed out as many people as possible to get to the very best, which means that you could be a fantastic player and you just messed up several times. You had a bad day and that's it. You didn't pass prelims. So I do think that that is the round where your pitch, your rhythm, your tone, and your basic understanding of the literature is very, very important. I do think that once you pass that round, there's more flexibility in terms of musicianship. Yet you usually have more time to play, so you can open up a little bit more. If you make a mistake in a 15-minute round as opposed to a 6-minute round, it's not going to have as much impact. So I do think that it's okay to kind of open up a little bit more musically in the later rounds. And I actually think that's what people are looking for in the committee more and more as the rounds go by.
Okay. I've got a totally impossible to answer question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because we're talking like, what makes somebody, bass player, oboist, whatever, stand out in and we could just talk about the final rounds if we want, or at any point. You must have had experiences where people just put down the pencil and just listen because it's so magical, and it may be absolutely impossible to generalize or find any takeaways. But do you have any thoughts on what makes a person really stand out to a committee?
Well, I think that's also very individual for each person, so I can't speak for anybody else that served on a committee. But for me, just hearing great music making in that final really means a lot to me, because by then you know that they're solid players, and even if they've had a bad day on the final day, you've already heard them twice before playing really, really well. So for me, I just want to hear really great music making, and that means something different to me than somebody else. So it's a really subjective thing, but that's what it is for me. I want to hear great music making. I also want to hear somebody that I know I'm going to enjoy playing with in the section if it's a bass player. do we kind of have the same idea of how this music should go? And it's hard to figure that out in any audition. You really don't get to know that until somebody actually joins the orchestra. But those are the things that go through my head.
And if you are invited to play a week with, say, the Pittsburgh Symphony or any orchestra as part of the process, any advice for comporting yourself, how you should handle yourself in that situation? What are people looking for when you're in that context? Any advice you might have for somebody who is in that position?
Yeah, once you go to play with an orchestra, your playing is, of course, the number one most important thing, but you also have to show that you're going to be a great colleague, that you're going to get along with everybody else, that you're not going to, stir the pot, that, you're going to blend in with the sound of the section. And that's going to be different for every single orchestra that you play with. Their sound's going to be different. So you have to get a kind of a feel for instance, when to place a pizzicato, or how the orchestra responds to the ictus of a baton. In Pittsburgh, we play way behind where the ictus is. So it takes a while for people that have never played for us to come in and try to figure out where those pizzicatos should be. And so those are the kinds of things, like trying to learn how to blend and being a good colleague. Those are so important.
Well, thinking about that pizzicato thing, I was just subbing a couple weeks in San Francisco Symphony, and it's like, I'm not auditioning for the San Francisco Symphony, but I would like to blend and fit in and play. And they play a bit behind the beat, maybe similar or maybe not as much as Pittsburgh. I'm not sure, but like, how do you know when to come in? Are you watching Jeff, or is it just like a mystical sort of sense that the bass section has? How does that work?
Well, in our section, I think that there's a lot of physical movement. So I think that if you learn how the players around you are moving, you're going to kind of pick up on that. But yeah, you always want to look at the principal player too, if you have a good view, because of course you're not always going to. Right. And then I think looking at the concert master, if you have a good view, is also very important. If you have pizzicatos with the whole string section. And if you can't see the concert master, then look at other principal players. But I think the number one thing is to try to feel what's going on right around you.
Okay.
And if there's like some movement in the section, I've had many of my students over the years have subbed with us, and they'll say that it's easy for them to kind of pick up on it because we are so physical with the way we approach the instrument that we kind of give a prep, each and every one of us, in a certain way. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. And probably not a good idea to go out on stage 45 minutes early and start blasting through Bottesini number 2. I'm assuming that's probably maybe not.
Well, I don't know. I have to say that kind of stuff never bothers me.
Yeah.
I feel like when we have guests come and play with us, and we often do have people coming and playing with us as a sub over the years, especially over the last few years, I want them to feel as comfortable as possible, because I know how stressful it is. Even if they're coming from another great orchestra, it can be stressful to come in and play. So we had Rob Kesselman here a few weeks ago. He was my stand partner. It was awesome. What a great player.
Yeah.
I don't care what he's going to play. He can play anything he wants to while he's warming up, And I kind of feel that way about everybody. I could see, though, how blasting a concerto I've heard people talk about that, but just so for me, I want people to feel as comfortable as possible when they come and play.
Well, that's great to know, because I think that's something that it sounds like a great scene. I've chatted with lots of people who've subbed with you guys over the years, and it seems like a great, obviously great ensemble and great bunch of bass players. And maybe we can, I never have any pre-scripted questions, but I usually like to ask people something about advice for their younger self. And we should definitely do a round 2. Maybe we can chat at the symposium next year. But this is definitely, hopefully, the first of many conversations. But maybe just we could wrap up with, if you could talk to, let's see, when did you drop out of Youngstown? You were about 20, or
I was 22.
22. Okay. So if you could go back in time and talk to 22-year-old Micah, any advice you might give him from this older self?
Well, be careful about your life choices. I don't really live with a lot of regret. I love my kids, so I'm so happy that I got married and I have my kids, and it's wonderful. My son is in the Air Force in Las Vegas, and my stepdaughter works for a hedge fund as an attorney in New York City, and I would not change that for the world, having them. But when you do get married at a young age, it puts a lot of strain on your career, no matter what it is. Mm-hmm. So, I actually have a student right now who's married and who's managing it very, very well. But it's difficult when you get married and you try to pursue, especially something like this, where it's really a high-risk profession. You put all this time into it, but things may never work out the way that you hope that they would. So the other thing that we didn't talk about that I wish I had known more about before I got into an orchestra is the political life of an orchestra. I don't know if you know, but I've been the chair of the orchestra committee for many years. I'm no longer on the committee right now, but I was involved in 3 negotiations, one in 2008 as the vice chair, 2013 as the chair, and then during the strike in 2016, I was the chief negotiator and the chair of the orchestra committee for that too. 2 months on strike. I mean, talk about something that's very, very difficult. And if you serve on a committee, which bass players often do, mm-hmm. we often end up serving on these committees. I wish I had known more about that, about how we have to struggle to actually even convince our board members what we're worth. Like, right. We're in this art form that isn't appreciated by people at large. It's just not. It's just a fact of life. They don't understand what we do. You know this. We get questions about what do we do for a living when you tell them that you play in an orchestra. And even board members who give their time and their money, they don't really completely understand. So something that young players should really know is once you get into an orchestra, it's not like that's the end of the road in terms of, what you're doing in terms of furthering the art form. It's not just about you once you get into an orchestra. It's about the art form itself and preserving that art form, and which is why I serve on the committee. It's not just about the Pittsburgh Symphony. I see it as fighting for this art form in the whole world, honestly, but especially in the United States. We have such a unique situation here, the way it's a nonprofit. It's always a struggle no matter where you are, whether you're in New York City, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, or San Francisco. It's always a struggle to find the money to support these organizations. I wish I had known more about that, but when you're so focused on winning the job, it's hard to know. But I like to talk to my students a lot about that, so they know what they're getting into when they actually join an orchestra. And I have several former students who serve on committees. Taylor Brown, who's principal in Chattanooga, is the president of the union there. And Nick Brown, who plays in San Antonio, has served as chair of the orchestra committee there during negotiations as well. And I think that's really important to get to know that aspect of what we do.
For sure. I was actually just staying with Kate Nettleman in Minnesota, who's in the Minnesota Orchestra, and they, of course, went through this very rough 15-month, lockout, and I was chatting with her yesterday about like what it's like coming back after something like that, and Pittsburgh Symphony wasn't out as long, but still, that's a really big deal for an organization to come to something like that. And it's a great point, like arts advocacy in general. It's stuff that, people talk about as they're in school and continues to be like, it's one of the most, we're always advocating, even at the highest levels, like Pittsburgh Symphony. I'm like, what was the morale? Since if it might be interesting to just hear about what was the morale like when you guys came back? Like, how did you start to build trust again? Because it's a tough thing, and you're working with these people on a daily basis, and then something like that happens, and then here we are again in the same room. How did you guys recover from that, just morale wise?
I don't think we've totally recovered from it even now. One of the reasons why I stepped down off the committee is because it was the stress level was just too much for me to continue to bear. I stayed on the committee as chair for a whole year after the settlement, and I still participate in a quarterly financial review, and also they're looking into possibly selling Heinz Hall, so I'm on a Heinz Hall task force as well. But it is difficult to build trust after something. I mean, that's one of the major problems when you go through that is trust. None of the constituencies trust each other. The management doesn't trust the musicians. The board don't trust the musicians. The musicians don't trust management. And the board is an extremely fragile thing. I said they give their money and their time, but they don't always view the organization the same way the musicians do. Right. Some of the board members I know for a fact in Pittsburgh just think, we don't need one of the world's greatest orchestras. We just need a regional orchestra that plays well. I mean, what does Pittsburgh need? That's what you start fighting against when you get into an orchestra. And I don't think it's just Pittsburgh that has board members like that. It's everywhere. That's why so many orchestras have gone through what they've gone through in recent history. Atlanta, Detroit, Minnesota. It all boils down to how we perceive our art form and the institution itself. So, yeah, we're still struggling with the trust issue. It's difficult. Yeah.
Well, I think it'd be super interesting at some point in the future, maybe to chat. Maybe we could do this at an ISB convention or something with, people like you and Kate and other people that have gone through this. I just interviewed a bassist. She's the executive director of the Shreveport Symphony, Lois Robinson, and she plays bass in Shreveport. And, that orchestra went through a lot, pretty catastrophic stuff in, I think, 2011. She came in, they had lost their nonprofit status even because people had just dropped the ball. And like, what do you even begin to talk? The audience didn't believe that there was really an orchestra. Nobody trusted anybody. So it'd be,
right.
I think it'd be an interesting topic to explore, and just like how do you advocate for this art form? How do you defend, whether it's at a regional orchestra level? I used to play in the Elgin Symphony, and I've been seeing articles in the Tribune about how they're, on the verge of, financial catastrophe. So at every level, this is something that we contend with.
Yeah. It's difficult, and we have, as musicians, we have to keep advocating for ourselves. It's very, very important. And I think it's important to do a lot of reading about the history of American orchestras. It's actually pretty interesting to read about that and our influence on labor activity in the United States because of ICSOM especially. Orchestra, the Musicians Union is a pretty powerful union in the United States, and people don't realize that either. Their understanding of that is very, it doesn't compute to them that there's actually, a union that the musicians belong to and things like that. So a great book is More Than Meets the Ear, which was written by the former principal second violinist of the Minnesota Orchestra long before this, their last struggle. But it's really interesting to read that book because she takes you through years and years of their own labor disputes, but also like she lays out the whole thing where they changed their name from the Minneapolis Symphony to the Minnesota Symphony, where the board just invited the whole orchestra to a meeting and just said, your name is now the Minnesota Orchestra. It just happened like that. That was it. And they had to deal with things where they would go on tour and people thought that they were actually a university orchestra because they had the name of their state instead of the name of the city. And people knew them back then. People knew them as the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra. Those are the old recordings of Minneapolis, not Minnesota.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, all those great. It was with Metropolis. There were these fantastic old recordings. Yeah, wow, it's super interesting. Okay, I just wrote that down. I'm going to check that book out. And my I've never been a full-time orchestra member, but I've been a union member since I was 22. And I think my admiration for what they do for musicians in general has grown through the years. I get a fuller understanding and talk with people about, and I realized after a certain point, even as a freelance musician, I was like, wow, my union gigs always pay more every year, and they're working, and these are the conditions, and it's a better scene, and other things I may have been doing never got any better or disappeared, or they wouldn't start on time, or they have 4-hour rehearsals or this or that. And so it's an important, it's super important. And thanks for your service for that. I know that's super frustrating work in many ways. But well, this is cool. Let's definitely. I think this would be a really interesting thing to do, to have some sort of panel talk on. Maybe we could even. Yeah. I don't know if you're going to ISB 2019, but that might be something that, because I know Ira Gold has served on a lot of committees and has got all sorts of thoughts. There are a lot of people that I think it could be
David
really interesting.
Anderson. David Anderson has served on committees quite a bit. Yeah. So
cool, Micah. This is so great.
Thanks so much for this. This is awesome.
Micah, thank you for chatting. It's so great to have you on the show. Folks, learn more about everything Micah's up to at his website, micahbhoward.com. And there you can download both his double bass handbook, which is a great technique book, and his scale book. They're both free. They're both there on the website. Thank you for everything you do for the bass community, Michael. And I can't wait to be part of the Pittsburgh Bass Symposium in 2019. What a cool event. I've followed along with it for years. And there's a link to that in the show notes, too, if you want to check it out. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. Mitch is making beautiful basses in the Dallas, Texas area, and you can learn more at mitchmooring.com. And thank you to Krista Copper for archiving and cataloging all the things we talk about on these episodes. That's so helpful for putting together best ofs and topic episodes in the future. I'm your host, Jason Heath, coming to you each and every week from San Francisco, California, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.